You're listening to Autumn on the Air, the weekly podcast that brings you conversations about the impact of research commercialization and the people who make it happen. Join us for interviews with patent and licensing professionals, innovators, entrepreneurs, and tech transfer leaders on the issues and trends that matter most. Keep listening for an inside track on the people, IP policies, and politics changing our world.
Welcome to Autumn on the Air. Today we're joined by Lily Zheng, a leading strategist, consultant, and author dedicated to building organizations that are fair, accessible, inclusive, and representative. Lily is the architect of the groundbreaking FAIR framework, a systematic approach to equity that replaces outdated DEI models with actionable outcomes. Their work, featured in the Harvard Business Review and their forthcoming book, Fixing Fairness, challenges institutions to move beyond performative gestures and redesign systems for measurable progress. Welcome to the podcast, Lily. Really excited to have you here on the air.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk.
Well, I'm really excited to have you on the podcast because I came across an article you wrote recently back in January of this year, in fact, in the Harvard Business Review entitled, What Comes After DEI? And you mentioned that DEI needs a reset, and you proposed something called the FAIR framework. Can you tell us a little bit about this new model that you're suggesting in place of DEI?
Absolutely. So this FAIR framework that I published in HBR this last January was created by looking through the last 30 to 40 years of DEI strategies, DEI programs, and DEI efforts across all sorts of industries, the corporate world, nonprofits, higher education, etc. What I was looking for were the things that set apart effective DEI work from the ineffective, performative fluff. And what I found, well, first of all, when I was looking through these efforts, I found a lot of ineffective, performative fluff, right? There were no shortage of programs that were PR efforts that were more, focused on looking good rather than doing good, that made a whole bunch of noise and a whole bunch of commitments to end racism or end sexism or all of that, and didn't achieve what they set out to achieve. So first of all, I found a lot of work calling itself DEI that just simply did not deliver on its promises. But I also found some positive examples of DEI efforts that succeeded. Sourced not only from the research, but from some of my colleagues in the field, from some of, my own work that I've been lucky enough to do. And what I wanted to do was to distill what worked from what didn't and repackage that into a new framework that was more defensible than the acronym DEI. And this was an intentional decision. I could have called it Effective DEI for 2025. And if you had asked me to do this, maybe mid-2024, I might have actually called it that. But sometime around late 2024, I had been telling people, look, I'm going to call it DEI so long as I think we can defend it and we can win. And sometime in 2024, I think the calculus changed for me. I started feeling like as practitioners, we had lost control of the narrative, that the anti-DEI folks had a completely incorrect, but more compelling mischaracterization of this work than practitioners and leaders could keep up with. And so around 2024, I wanted to make sure that those of us doing this work had an option to continue sustaining our impact, to continue doing the work that mattered, and, to continue actually ending discrimination, creating healthier workplaces, building environments for everybody, desegregating the workplace, which was originally the goal of DEI back in the 60s that we still have yet to achieve. I wanted us to have an option. And so enter this FAIR framework. First of all, it's called FAIR and not DEI by design, because I think calling it FAIR speaks to the fundamental goal of this work, which has always existed. That being, we want to make workplaces fair. We want to create a workplace that works for everybody, that treats people fairly. The letters of the acronym FAIR stand for fairness, access, inclusion, and representation. I think these are each very important things. They're pretty similar to diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you ask me, they're just packaged more neatly. The real meat of this framework is not in the letters, but in the principles. So there are 4 principles behind the FAIR framework. Very simply put, outcomes, systems, coalitions, win-win. I'll say that again. Outcomes, systems, coalitions, win-win. And these are the 4 major themes across all effective DEI work, right? What do I mean by that? 1, outcomes. They measure what they're actually trying to change. It might sound basic. It's not basic. A huge proportion of DEI work doesn't even measure what it's trying to change. And because it lacks that fundamental basic tenet of accountability, we have no idea whether it worked. And so when people come calling and say, prove that your DEI program actually, means something, practitioners will unfortunately just say, well, can you believe me if I say that it's really important? Which doesn't really hold up when DEI is under attack. Next, systems. We focused a lot on the self-helpification of DEI. We've made DEI about becoming the perfect person, the person who's read all the things, who's taken all the trainings, who's the perfect ally, who knows as much as they can about DEI. But we have not taken that same amount of focus on systems, on our workplaces, on our policies, our processes, our practices, our workplace cultures. And so instead, we've spent so much time kind of going after individual people. We've made this DEI conversation about whether you're a good person or a bad person, instead of whether you are an imperfect person operating in more or less fair systems. I think the programs that succeed are those that correctly diagnose that the system is the problem, the environment is the problem. You can have imperfect people in a system that's so well designed that it still creates fair outcomes for everybody. I'd much prefer that over trying to rely on making everybody a quote unquote perfect, unbiased person, which as a social scientist, I personally don't believe that's even possible. And the next, coalitions. DEI, the way that it was carried out in many workplaces, became about a series of splintered single issue causes, right? Just look at the way employee resource groups are organized, right? You've got Black issues in one corner, Asian issues in another corner, disability issues in another corner, women's issues, LGBTQ plus issues, religious issues, all of these things as separate things, jockeying for our time and attention. Instead of broad movements across these different groups that work together to build coalition and fight for shared progress. I tell people often, right? The civil rights movement wasn't won because of allyship. It was one because of coalitions. It was one because of all of these groups saying our well-being is intrinsically tied to each other's well-being, right? We are all working towards these things together. Perhaps our lived experiences are a little different. Perhaps our demands and our requests are a little different, but not different enough to justify us splintering off and doing our own thing. We are stronger together. And so coalitions are a hallmark of effective DEI work. And finally, because I've been talking for a while, this was a quick question you asked me, and I've been giving you a long answer. Win-win, because DEI has always been about the win-win, right? A rising tide lifts all boats, including the boats of, the cisgender heterosexual white dude named Greg down the hall, right? Like DEI is genuinely about making things better for everyone. And when we lose sight of that, when we don't communicate that, we can get trapped by this zero-sum messaging that opponents of DEI like to wield. They say DEI is coming after your job. DEI is coming after your opportunity. DEI is coming after your family. And if we can't recognize that these are blatant mischaracterizations and push back, then we can end up losing control of the narrative, like unfortunately many practitioners have. So now we're spending all day debating whether DEI is actually, anti-white dude, instead of actually doing this work, right? The win-win helps us get past that. The win-win helps us focus on actually creating change and actually, putting into practice our vision for a better world for everyone.
Well, thank you. That was very, very helpful. And I'm curious, how do you think FAIR will be able to succeed maybe where DEI has essentially failed?
Yeah. So DEI, mainstream DEI at least, because something that I tell people often is that there's fundamentally no difference between highly effective DEI work and FAIR. They're the same thing. But there's a big difference between average mainstream DEI work and FAIR. So where mainstream DEI work has failed is that it was always heavily siloed, heavily, jargon filled and full of platitudes, and never truly sought to engage people who it didn't perceive as its beneficiaries. DEI work was always about being in this corner and doing our best to make a better workplace. And when you had detractors, when you had pushback, mainstream DEI would say, just ignore them. Just ignore them. It's fine. They don't have any power here, right? They're just bigots. They're just terrible people. We don't have to pay attention to them. And because DEI spent first of all, if DEI had delivered tons of results while applying that strategy, that'd be one thing. But it didn't. Because oftentimes many of those detractors were in fact people in positions of power. Like many of them were in fact executives. And so I've talked to practitioners who have said, look, all of my work relies on executive buy-in. And I'll say, okay, that makes sense. How are you getting executive buy-in? And this practitioner will say, well, the executives don't really get it. And so we're just going on ahead without their buy-in. I'm like, okay, what can you achieve without their buy-in? Oh, yeah, we have a handful of lunch and learns and 1 hour programs and, practitioners that I bought, that I brought in for $500 because that's all the discretionary budget I have. But I don't need their buy-in. That's plenty of work. And that's the problem with this, right? Because the gatekeepers of power, like it or not, and most of us don't like it, may not always be on board with DEI. Rather than take the work to bring these people along with us, a lot of people decided, some impact is better than no impact, and invest a lot of their time and energy in these performative, low impact efforts. Then when the tides changed, because these performative, low impact efforts never had the blessings of leadership teams, they were very easy to undo. They were trivial to undo because they were never really, that difficult to start in the first place. That's exactly what we're seeing in many workplaces that never truly did that deep work to build buy-in. And we're now seeing their DEI programs get reversed. So I do think, FAIR is not perfect. FAIR is just a new framework for doing this work. It really lies on the practitioners utilizing the framework and doing so differently than they utilized DEI. So my quick answer to you is that there's nothing inherent about FAIR that will ensure that it succeeds. But I think as a framework, it is more defensible than DEI was. And it gives practitioners more tools to talk about their work, justify their work, and build buy-in. If we can say that FAIR, by definition, is outcome-centered, systems-focused, coalitions-driven, and win-win, and we repeat that every single day, right? That will help us build buy-in with leaders who have historically said, well, what's DEI about? Is DEI Oppression Olympics? Is DEI about who has the most marginalized identities? Is DEI about, me apologizing for being white? Most practitioners will say, no, it's none of those things, right? Instead, and then they'll go on a 20-minute lecture about the minute differences between equity and equality and all these things. And they've already, lost the attention of corporate audiences. I think it's very simple, right? We need to make workplaces fair. We do that by centering outcomes, systems, coalitions, win-win. That's it. We just repeat that ad nauseum.
So what's the reaction been? I realize it's not been very long since your article came out, and I know you've been doing a lot of talking about FAIR. What has the reception been like? I mean, we're in a very polarizing time right now, given our current administration in Washington. So what's the response been, especially since so many companies and other institutions are completely rolling back their DEI or eliminating it altogether?
So I'll tell you a little secret, which is that before this article about the FAIR framework was published, it's not like I was doing something different before January. Like I've been talking about the work in this way, and not just me, by the way. Many practitioners have been talking about this work this way for years. And I can tell you, as far back as 2018, 2019, I was pushing leaders to think about this work in terms of outcome systems, coalitions, and win-win. Maybe not with that exact language, right? It's a little punchier now, but I've been working with people to understand that this is what the work has always been about. And since 2018, 2019, the reception has been positive. Many leaders have said, look, now it makes sense to me. Of course, this was all about fairness, right? Of course, this is what this work is about. Let's get to work. Let's roll our sleeves up. Let's actually do some of this work. Now, I never published that super broadly because, the folks that I was working with were doing just fine. I think the reason why I ended up putting this framework out there is I realized that more practitioners and more leaders needed that kind of guidance at this point in time. So since January, it's the article was received well, but I don't want to make this sound like fair work never existed until January, right? Like people have been doing this effectively for years and years and years now. And like even this framework itself builds upon the scholarship and legacy of lots of other practitioners. For example, John A. Powell from the Berkeley Othering and Belonging Institute, his idea of targeted universalism. That's a fundamental premise that I think FAIR bakes in, right? Like there's so many things like this that FAIR builds upon that just make sense, right? They're common sense, effective philosophies that undergird DEI work that works. So I certainly don't want to claim sole credit for all of this, right? Like I stand on the shoulder of giants. The FAIR framework is just the latest iteration that I put out there just to give people a little more guidance and support.
Now, the listeners predominantly to this podcast are in universities or university tech transfer offices. And there have been directives that have come out of the White House where they're looking at grants and funding to universities and basically not allowing funding anytime diversity, equity, gender, inclusivity, any of those types of words or programs or languages being used. So there's a lot of concern. There's a lot of fear on university campuses right now. Talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing and also what guidance and suggestions you might have for universities and research institutions.
Yeah. So I'm also seeing similar things in the sense that a lot of university administrators and leaders are over complying in advance. Essentially, they are taking these intimidation tactics, which, by the way, are making threats that are not legal, right? Like we have a number of Supreme Court cases that have weighed in on these threats, and they have ruled that these kinds of attacks, these kinds of threats going after higher education institutions, right, or corporations, nonprofits, these are not legal, right? Like the government cannot just unilaterally withdraw its funding on the basis of like, oh, you said the word diversity, right? So that's one thing. But I am seeing a lot of organizations scared. A lot of leaders are scared. They're risk averse. They're thinking, oh, if there's any chance that we could lose our funding, we'll just preemptively get rid of every possible thing that they ask for. And not only is this a terrible idea in terms of, universities retaining the trust of their staff, their employees, their contractors, their students, their donors, right? Like not only is this a terrible idea that's likely to basically destroy the trust that stakeholders put in higher education institutions, it's also not even going to help. Like it's not going to stop these kinds of attacks coming from the federal government, right? Like what do we do if the federal government says, hey, if you have the word women, we're going to withdraw your funding? What are you going to do? Roll over?
Fire half of your faculty? Yeah.
Fire half your faculty, right? At some point, you need to realize that in the face of bullying, which is a very nice way to say authoritarianism, you need to take a stand as a leader, right? As a leader, you have power and you have influence. It's yours to use. No one else can use it. And unfortunately, I think a lot of university administrators are, for many very understandable reasons, one of which is they don't know what to do. But regardless, they're not acting. They're frozen. They're scared. And beyond that, there are some that are so scared that they're acting in the wrong direction. They're complying in advance. And it's going to take their institution down a road where they get hit with traffic going both ways, right? It does not allow them to escape the backlash. And it sure as hell does not build goodwill and trust with the people that rely on them and that they're fighting for, right? Like this is the quickest way to become irrelevant as an institution, right? And it's a risk that I wish more administrators were taking, or were taking into consideration rather.
Yeah, absolutely. So what can we do to help tech transfer offices continue to make strides using the FAIR framework? Where do they start? There's a lot of confusion now. People are just kind of, like you said, they're being over compliant. So assuming we can get people to focus on FAIR, where do they begin this work in kind of rebuilding what they've been working on the last few years?
Yeah. So first of all, understand the law, right? Talk to your general counsel and understand what is truly, and I mean truly, a risk. The executive orders coming out said that they would target illegal DEI, right? And I think if you're terrified and if you're risk averse, you will interpret that as, oh, all DEI is illegal? Okay, goodbye, all DEI. The reality of it, and I've been talking with legal scholars about this and working with legal scholars about this, is that the vast majority of DEI programs have always been highly legal. When you look at effective DEI programs, these are things like we're trying to level the playing field by mitigating bias in decision making, right? Or we're trying to increase the number of candidates or applicants, right? So that our candidate pool broadly represents the country. These are all very legal, right? Like these efforts have always been legal and will always be legal unless the rule of law changes to like, oh, you have to discriminate by law, right? Which both of the legal scholars that I've talked to recently have said this is highly unlikely anytime soon. If that becomes the case, sure, we'll have another conversation down the line. But for now, you need to understand the law and understand the difference between what is being threatened and what you're actually required to comply with, right? What you actually need to follow the law for. So look, if you have a program that's worded in terms of, look, we recognize historically that racism happened and we need to correct the racism that's happened. This is a program only for members of this marginalized group, and we're going to confer a benefit to members of this marginalized group to lift them up. Yeah, that's going to be risky. If you have programs like that, you should change those programs. There's a lot of important work happening right now to audit and review existing programs to make sure that they comply. That is not the same thing as, okay, I guess I'll just lay off 100% of my DEI related professional staff. I don't even know where you can, like how you can jump from point A to point B, right? Like it's clearly an overreaction. And so the first step is to understand the law. The second step is to follow the law, right? And make any necessary adjustments to your programs. By the way, you should have been making adjustments to those programs for years now. So if you're just now, recognizing that you've been doing illegal DEI, like, damn, your general counsel is slacking, right? And then, you need to use the full force of your institution to defend the highly legal and effective work that you're doing. Like, this is the part that everyone's missing. Like, you have power, use it. Say we're not going to be intimidated. Like, this is who we are as an institution. Like, this work allows us to, attract our donors, to serve our students, to reach our community, to achieve our goals, right? To, democratize access to education for everyone in this country. Like, this work is essential. This work is legal. Now get off my lawn and let me do my business, right? Like, we need to be able to say that.
It's so hard for universities, though. I mean, they're looking at having significant funding pulled if they use, there's a list of magic words that the government is looking for in some of these programs. And so to your point, I think it's carving out, it's language based, right? It's making sure you use the right language and frame things in the right way to kind of avoid kind of that level of scrutiny.
Yeah, for sure. And look, if you have to change your language, make sure you're not changing your impact, right? I worked with a team literally just this morning. I was talking to this team literally just this morning that said, look, Lily, we can't use any of the words we've been using for the last 10 years, right? How do we continue doing this? Like, what does this look like? And we ended up looking through all of their programs. We ended up, doing a theory of change exercise and looking at the impact of every single initiative. And I asked them, look, is there any other way you can imagine doing this? Is there any other way you could achieve the same impact using the same staff, using a creative allocation of resources, using a creative, way to talk about this work? How can you level the playing field if you're not allowed to talk about the playing field? There's actually lots of ways, right? Like the other day, a client was like, okay, Lily, like if it's so easy, then why don't you do it, right? Like, how do you talk about DEI without doing DEI? And I said, great, that's a really good challenge, right? So we care about anti-discrimination for all groups across all protected characteristics. Maybe I can't even name the protected characteristics now. That's fine, right? We care about anti-discrimination. To ensure anti-discrimination, we seek to identify disparities in people's employment outcomes and people's workplace well-being. Once we've identified these disparities in workplace well-being, we are going to understand why and how they emerge so that we can fix these problems. Our team of problem solvers is going to go in and ensure that these workplace systems are fair and treat everybody fairly on the basis of merit to ensure that no discrimination is taking place. Period. Done.
No, I think that's really, really great advice. And so it sounds to me like your message is, don't be scared. Don't give up what you're doing. There are ways to be compliant, and there are still great ways to, by using, FAIR, to achieve really good results and increase inclusivity.
The results are what matters. Exactly. Right? Like, look, the language is a tool. You don't have to use FAIR. You could call it DEI if you want to. You could call it belonging if you wanted to. You could call it just being a responsible higher education institution. I don't care. Right? What matters is your impact. Language is a tool to achieve impact, not the same as impact. If we see language as the beginning and the end, right, we can end up really stuck in this myopic point of view where we just end up debating words all day. I don't want to debate words. I want to get shit done. I want to do stuff, right? And I think everyone listening here also wants to do stuff. We want and we care so much about these communities that we are working towards. So let's think a little more strategically here. Like, if we can't do things the way we've always done things, let's do things in a radically new way as long as they work. And if we don't know if they work, great. Let's start measuring some stuff. Let's start experimenting. Let's start innovating, right? We're in higher education, for heaven's sake, right? Like, we have critical thinking skills. Let's use them. Like, there's so much we know how to do.
Absolutely. Well, Lily, this has been great. Before I let you go, what message of hope would you have for university tech transfer offices?
Yeah. Well, first of all, hopefully this entire thing has been a message of hope, or maybe I've just sounded very indignant the entire time. But I truly believe that we have more than enough capacity, skill, right? Care, generosity to do this work. Like, I know everybody in these institutions cares so deeply. And it's on us right now to put all of our energy and all of our skill towards ensuring that we continue to sustain this impact. It's very much possible. I see it happen every single day with the leaders that I work with, right? They're all finding creative solutions for how to move this forward to ensure that we don't go backwards in time and we instead go forward and continue making this progress. You can do it too. You're likely already doing it, right? We just have to get off our butts, find some real time to grieve. I'm going to acknowledge that there is real grieving to be done. There's a lot of loss happening right now, a lot of pain, a lot of suffering. That's real. I'm not going to pretend like it's not. But once we grieve, we have to get back into it. We have to look to our colleagues and say, what can we do together? We have to build coalitions. We have to talk with those in power to say, what can we do together to get through this? Because fear is not the only option. We have so many others. And hope is one thing. Hope combined with the efficacy and the confidence that we know what we're doing, that's a whole nother thing. And that's what I hope we can muster up in ourselves in the coming weeks and months as we continue doing this work.
Lily, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. We know you're extraordinarily busy. We really appreciate you being on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Autumn on the Air with Lisa Mueller. Get social with us and share your thoughts. You can tweet us at AUTM or visit us online at AUTM.net. We'll be back next week on the air. Be sure to join us.